Welcome to this part of Introduction to Principles and Practice of Clinical Research. My name is Nick Gaiano, and I work at the National Institute of Health. And today I will be presenting a portion of several parts on the NIH peer review process. Those parts, part one was the fundamentals of the grant application submission process. Now I'll be talking about the peer review process in particular. And then the third part, we talk about application content and early career awards. And then finally, tips to help you be successful with your grant applications. As I said, my name is Nicholas Gaiano, as is shown here on the slide. So I'll be talking about how study sections work today, or what goes on in the context of study sections when they evaluate grant applications. So first, it's important to make the point that grant applications are reviewed by the NIH at two different levels. So there's the first level of review, which is the study section. That is also called the scientific review group. And those panels are charged with evaluating the scientific merit of the application. And they will discuss applications. They will write critiques up. Those groups will rate and score the applications. And provide recommendations. They'll usually look at a pool of applications and draw some conclusions based on the applications individually and also as a pool. Those groups, however, do not make funding decisions. They are strictly charged with assessing the quality of the applications. Subsequent to that, there's what's called the second level of review at the NIH, and that's at the NIH Institute Advisory Council. And those groups, together with staff at the different institutes, like the National Institute of Mental Health or the National Cancer Institute, they will take the information as far as the merit review has gone from the study sections. We'll look at that information and we'll consider other aspects of important priorities for the institute, et cetera. And they will then proceed to make funding recommendations. There's a lot of issues that go into that consideration. But really, the initial step from the perspective of an applicant relates to the study section. That's really a critical part of the process, and that if an application is deemed strong, its prospects for potentially being funded are, of course, much higher. So what happens before a study section meeting? Well, of course, your application comes in, and aspects of that were, of course, covered in the previous part of this part of the course. The individual at the NIH that really oversees the review process is called the Scientific Review Officer, or the SRO. That person will recruit reviewers. They will have to assemble the panel of people that are going to evaluate your application and any other applications that are being put together, either because they've come in for a specific initiative or they are being pooled based on their subject matter for other reasons. The SRO will recruit the panel, will orient the panel regarding confidentiality, which is a critical part of the process, and also conflicts of interest. So the idea here really is that the review be fair and impartial. So people cannot be expressing their thoughts on the merit of an application if there's some reason to think they would favor certain applications or disfavor others based on other aspects of their personal or professional lives. And the scientific review officer is really responsible for all the correct policies, processes being followed, and for the reviewers to use the proper review criteria when they're evaluating applications. The study section review panel, those are sort of interchangeable terms, really typically is comprised of about 10 to 30 reviewers. They can be smaller and they can be larger, but that's the most typical range. And it really depends on the number of applications that need to be evaluated by a given grouping and the breadth of the science that's needed to be covered for that review meeting. So if you have a wide range of topics in a given review meeting, if you really want to cover the expertise appropriately, you're going to need more reviewers. Where if you have a pool of applications that are all in the same general scientific area, you can usually get by with fewer reviewers, with each of them looking at a larger fraction of the applications. Now, reviewers are typically experts in the field, so these are recruited by the SRO, as indicated above, They're primarily academics, but we can also get individuals from industry at times, and it really just depends on what expertise is needed and what's appropriate. Review groups can be either what are called standing study sections, which have defined members. They have a defined what's called charter that can usually be found described on the internet. But many review panels that are brought together are what are called special emphasis panels. So those are constructed de novo each time for a given pool of applications on a certain subject or of a certain type. So standing study sections have a very clearly defined area with defined members, although temporary members are often brought in for any given meeting as additional expertise is needed. And special emphasis panels are, they're created much more specifically for a given review. The peer review process, what typically goes on is the SRO will assign particular members of the panel before the meeting, well before the meeting, in fact, typically 4 to 6 weeks, will assign individuals on the panel with applications to review. Now, a typical application will have 3 assigned reviewers. These are the people that are going to look most closely at the application and will formulate the most informed assessments initially. Those individuals will submit preliminary critiques, and they have to fill out a whole bunch of information. There's a very specific format that those critiques are submitted in, and they will also provide preliminary scores. I'll talk a bit more about scoring in a minute. The meetings are typically 1 to 2 days long, and these are meetings when once all these reviews are submitted by the reviewers, then there is in fact an actual convening of the group to evaluate the applications together and discuss them. So what happens during a study section meeting? Well, the SRO is the scientific review officer. That's the person that oversees the whole process. However, in the context of a peer review meeting, the SRO is also what's called the designated federal official. That peer review meeting and any deliberation on the part of the panel with respect to those reviews cannot occur without the SRO present. So if the SRO for some reason has to leave temporarily, the meeting has to stop, and then it can only resume when the SRO is present. The idea there is that all communications and deliberations that go into a panel evaluating an application need to occur in the presence of a designated federal official who knows the policies, who can track what transpires, and for these kinds of meetings, that is the SRO. So at the beginning of the meeting will initiate, and these meetings often used to happen in person. I presume will happen in person. They're starting to happen in person again, but many of these meetings occur by a video conference. And so all the panel members will see each other and will start to introduce each other at the beginning of the meeting so everyone understands who's participating. The SRO needs to provide guidance at the beginning of the meeting, again, regarding confidentiality and conflict of interest. Those were provided in advance, of course, because it's important that reviewers understand those issues while they're looking at the applications. But the panel is again reminded about these critical aspects of the process. Then what the group will do, typically there's a level of enthusiasm that has been determined pre-meeting by the assigned reviewers. Some applications they think are better than others. And what will happen then is there'll be some kind of preliminary enthusiasm levels for all these applications based on the 3 assigned reviewers' levels of enthusiasm and initial scores. And what typically happens is there's a range from applications that reviewers are very enthusiastic about to somewhat enthusiastic to not very enthusiastic about. And those can be ordered in terms of enthusiasm. Of course, sometimes there are differences of opinion, and those are important to be sorted out both by the SRO and also the reviewers. But typically, in the interest of efficiency, there may be a subset of the applications that are not discussed. So they will still have a full review pre-meeting, but they won't be discussed by the whole panel. And that's something that needs to be agreed upon by the whole panel at the meeting. So it needs to be a unanimous assessment. If there's an application that is slated to not be discussed, any panel member can rescue that and say, I would like to discuss this application, and then it will be added to that group. Now, discussed applications, applications that are discussed at the meeting will receive what's called a priority score, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, as well as a summary of the discussion written by the SRO. However, all applications will receive a summary statement, and that is, for those that are not discussed, it'll be the written critiques of the 3 assigned reviewers. Panel discussions for each application is typically approaching about 20 minutes. It depends. An R01, which is kind of the traditional investigator-initiated research project grant, those discussions typically take about 20 minutes. So the panel has enough time to discuss what the application is about, the significance of the work, and then to actually talk about the strengths and weaknesses. But of course, you could imagine a group of scientists could spend an hour, 2 hours talking about any given project, but they need to spend enough time for the group to get a sense of where they think the strength of the application stands, and then to also move through meetings, which can often have dozens of applications, if not more, in them. Each application is scored by all panel members. So this is each application that is discussed. I'm sorry. Those are scored by all panel members at the end of the discussion. Okay. Now, the main criteria, I don't want to dwell on these, but the main criteria that are discussed, say, for research project grants, which are one of the most commonly submitted grants, called things like R01s, R21s, R03s. The 5 core criteria, 3 are shown here: significance, investigator, and innovation. And of course, I'm not going to read all this, but you can read it when you have time if you want to pause. Significance really is, if the project is successful, ultimately, the question really is, how important will it be to the field? What sort of advances will it make? So, for example, significance is not, well, I'm working on cancer research and all cancer research is important. The question is, with respect to your project, if it's a cancer research project, if the project that you've developed is successful, what impact will that have on the cancer research field, for example? Investigators are an important aspect. Do you have the right investigators? Are they properly qualified? Do you have all of the expertise that's needed? Innovation can play a big role in how these applications are evaluated. Is this going to develop new methods? Is it bringing together 2 parts of the field that are not typically there? Is it taking other innovative approaches? It does not have to only be technical innovation by any means. The other 2 elements in the 5 core review criteria are the approach and the environment. Now, the approach is a biggie. This is really often the most substantial aspect of how these applications are evaluated. As you can imagine, it's really basically describing all the experiments, really laying the foundation in terms of the scientific premise. That's where preliminary data would be located. That's where any hypotheses are put forth. It's really the meat and potatoes of the application, so to speak. And it's typically what tends to be viewed as most important for ultimately evaluating the merit of the application. The environment is also important. So, is the institutional environment suitable for the folks to get this project done as needed? Do they have adequate collaborative opportunities? Is there institutional support if needed? Do they have the needed facilities? Those kinds of things. There are other review criteria which are important, and you really need to pay attention to all aspects of this. Some of the details regarding the actual construction of an application will be covered in other parts of this part of the course. But it's worth noting that these are all elements that go into the application and that are evaluated by the reviewers. Human subjects, data safety monitoring plan for clinical trials. There can also be funding opportunity announcement or FOA specific review criteria, whether an application is a resubmission or a renewal, if you're asking for additional money to support a project that you've been working on. So it's important to pay attention to all of these as are appropriate for your application. Now, application scoring, it's worth understanding how this works. This is something that's done by the review panel. The assigned reviewers will each assign a preliminary what's called an overall impact score. They will also give scores to the 5 core criteria I mentioned, which are significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment. And I mentioned those a few slides ago. Those are rated 1 to 9, with 1 being the best and 9 being the worst. But the overall impact score is really the most important aspect of what ultimately is going to contribute to how the application is judged regarding its strength. The overall impact score is a single number from 1 to 9, but the reviewers also provide what's called an overall impact paragraph, where they, in addition to having a breakdown of more specific content in their critique, that paragraph is really where they sum up what were the strengths and weaknesses that most contributed to the initial score that they selected. The emphasis on the review criterion that I described earlier may vary on each of those review criterion, the 5 core criteria or other aspects, and that'll depend on the nature of the application and of the reviewer in question. Now, priority score is not simply an average of subscores for the 5 core criteria, so that's worth keeping in mind. So you may see 5 scores ranging from 1 to 9 for the core criteria, and it may seem that the overall impact score isn't the average of those, but it typically isn't. In fact, I would say most typically the overall impact paragraph tracks most closely with the approach and the significance. After discussion of an application, all panel members will give scores from 1 to 9, 1 being the best and 9 being the worst. And they'll be informed in that assessment by the comments of the assigned reviewers, and then also whatever discussion has occurred between the entire panel. That content should give reviewers on the panel who haven't read it as carefully as the 3 assigned reviewers the ability to make a judgment call and to use the information available to them to come up with a score. Now, when the whole panel votes, so say you have a panel of 20 reviewers, the whole panel votes, they put their scores into the system, they vote 1 to 9. The priority score that emerges for an application is typically the average of all of those scores. So if you have 20 reviewers and all of their scores ranged from 2 to 5, you average that. So let's imagine the average turned out to perfectly be 3.5, but the priority score is that average times 10. So when you get a summary statement back and you see a 35, that's how that number was derived. Now, applications may also sometimes receive a percentile score, which is really indicating the relative merit with respect to other applications. So you can get a certain priority score, but that's a number you don't really know how that compares. Where other applications in the pool, they have better priority scores, worse, where did yours land? But if an application is 20th percentile, that basically tells you that it's sort of at the top, in the top 20%, towards the bottom of that range. Okay, so I mentioned several times summary statements. The summary statement documents the review outcome. This is the actual report that you would receive. It is prepared by the SRO, and what it contains is the priority score that I just described, and any percentiles that, not all applications are percentiled, I should point out, but when they are, it'll be on the summary statement. And that'll depend on how the application is reviewed and what types of meetings. Applications and standing panels are typically percentiled. Applications and special emphasized panels are typically not. Only discussed applications will have a priority score, so just as a reminder. There'll also be content regarding whether the human subjects protections and inclusion plans are adequate. For applications that are discussed, as I mentioned, there'll also be a resume and summary of discussion, which will help you understand, and the program staff you're working with will help you understand what was the most important aspects of how this application came to its score. There'll be the core criteria subscores, and also you will get the written critiques of the 3 assigned reviewers. So you'll be able to see exactly what they said, and you should hopefully be able to understand how that fed into perhaps the score overall, or what's in the, or why an application wasn't discussed perhaps, and also what's in the resume. You'll also get any budget recommendations if the committee concludes that the budget you requested is reasonable, or they think perhaps that it's Maybe it's excessive. They may make comments along those lines and recommendations, and there'll also be a roster of the study section. Scores and summary statements are typically going to be posted in the NIH ERA Commons. So you would have an account, of course. That's how you submitted your application. And summary statements are used by program staff and the Institute advisory councils in making their funding determinations. You can and should discuss prospects for whether your application will be funded and whether resubmitting, if it was reviewed but it was not successful, you have options to resubmit where you revise it and then send it back in. You can talk to your program officer and look at the summary statement to figure out if resubmitting makes sense, depending upon the feedback. Finally, so what determines which applications are awarded? Now, this slide actually segues into the next part of this part of the course. And I believe this actually repeats, but it's really kind of the juncture between the two. There are really three major elements. The priority score, which really relates to, it's not just the priority score really, but it's also aspects of how the application was evaluated overall. So, and of course, the priority score is indicative of the level of enthusiasm of the panel. Some institutes have what's called a pay line, which means they will determine that a certain priority score or percentile ranking, they will pay or fund everything that's better than that line. And then they may do what's called select pay beyond that. But not all institutes have what's called a pay line. What also factors in are programmatic considerations. So there may be an interest on the part of an institute in having a balance of experimental models or different types of diseases, different types of approaches. They want to have a well-rounded portfolio. And also there are issues about institute priorities. I just gave an example here, which would be to see, for example, the NIH website, but you can, of course, see that for all of the institutes. Finally, there's an issue about availability of funds. And that often is really what ultimately determines where the funding cutoff is, because the institute has only so many resources and there are a lot of good projects out there. And so those are the three factors that will go into how the review process then feeds into which applications are awarded. Okay, that's it for this segment. Again, my name is Nick Gaiano, and thank you for your attention.